the last 10 years of the 19th century, the popular form of literature was romance, escape with happy endings. To Stephen Crane, such writing was false, for he saw little of this romance in the harsh lives endured by most people. He wanted to write about the miseries and the hypocrisies of actual life, as well as the happy moments. He wanted to know whether truth was fair or bitter. In his writing, he set himself an uncompromising standard of personal honesty.
I understand that a man is born into the world with his own pair of eyes, and he is not at all responsible for his vision. He is merely responsible for his quality of personal honesty. To keep close to this personal honesty is my supreme ambition.
The vision of Stephen Crane began to take shape, artistic shape, in Sullivan County, New York, the setting of his first sketches. Hiking, camping, enjoying the freedom of the wilderness. Crane loved to roam the wooded hills beyond Port Jervis, where sunlight is noise and darkness is a great, tremendous silence. His special love was riding.
What can be finer than a fine frosty morning, a runaway horse, and only the still hills to watch? Lord, I do love a crazy horse with just a little pigskin between him and me.
Crane relished meeting the challenge of the unexpected, the untamed. He was testing himself. To write truthfully about others, he first had to know himself.
When I reached 21 years and first scanned my personal egotism, I was fairly dazzled by the size of it. The Matterhorn could be no more than a 10-pin to it. Perhaps I have succeeded in lowering it a trifle.
Crane's poems often explode with a final ironic twist. They are short, unrhymed, not at all flowery.
I have heard the sunset song of the birches, a white melody in the silence. I have seen a quarrel of the pines. At nightfall, the little grasses have rushed by me with the windmen. These things have I lived, quoth the maniac, possessing only eyes and ears. But you don green spectacles before you look at roses.
In his poems, Crane wrote of life as a lonely journey, during which one must closely examine the particulars of one's existence to find out what is really there.
I walked in a desert and I cried, "Ah, God, take me from this place." A voice said, "It is no desert." I cried, "Well, but the sand, the heat, the vacant horizon." A voice said, "It is no desert."
What kind of life did he have, this young man whose vision was so ironic? Stephen Crane was born in Newark, New Jersey in 1871, 5 years after the Civil War ended. He was the 14th and last child of Jonathan Crane, a Methodist minister, and his wife Mary. When the boy was 9, his father died. Of his father's death, Crane remembered,
"He was so simple and good that I often think he didn't know much of anything about humanity. He worked himself to death, my people thought. We tell kids that heaven is just across the gaping grave and all that bosh, and then we scare them to glue with flowers and white sheets and hymns we ought to be crucified for it. I've forgotten nothing about this, not an iota, not a shred."
After her husband's death, Mrs. Crane moved her family to Asbury Park, New Jersey, a popular seaside resort.
After my father died, Mother lived in and for religion. We had very little money. My brother Will used to try to argue with her on religious subjects such as hell, but he always gave it up. He could argue just as well with a wave.
While still a teenager, Stephen Crane began to write news reports and sketches for syndication by his brother's New Jersey Coast News Bureau. Crane's essays of life on the Jersey Shore went deeper than mere reporting of who stayed in what hotel and which conventions assembled where. He hunted for news and described the people he saw with all the skill of a man knocking over wooden pins with a baseball at a boardwalk amusement booth. No one escaped his notice or his aim.
The average summer guest here is a rather portly man with a good watch chain and a business suit of clothes, a wife, and about 3 children. All day he lies in the sand, while his blessed babies are dabbling around, throwing sand down his back and emptying their little pails of seawater in his boots. He enjoys himself in a mild way and dribbles out a lot of money under the impression he is proceeding cheaply.
Crane was 21 when he wrote the following description of the summer girl of Asbury Park.
She is a maiden with a bonny blue eye and a tender smile and a red heart, palpitant under fields of white. At any rate, she makes life at summer resorts. She is a bit of interesting tinsel flashing near the somber-hued waves. She gives the zest to life on the great boardwalk. The crowd on the boardwalk would be a mob without the smile of the summer girl.
In 1890, Crane attended Lafayette College for one difficult semester and dropped out. In January, he tried again, this time at Syracuse University. During his one semester there, he devoted most of his energy to the varsity baseball team. He flunked algebra, chemistry, physics, elocution, and German, but got an A in English literature.
When I was at school, I confined my abilities, such as they were, to the diamond. Not that I disliked books, but the cut-and-dried curriculum of the college did not appeal to me. Humanity was a much more interesting study.
Crane recovered from college in New York City, where his real education began. There, he lived a bohemian life with some artists, Indians, as he called them. His fingers were yellowed from constant cigarette smoking, and he looked like a man badly nourished. This evaluation was made by Hamlin Garland, himself a successful author, who extended friendship and encouragement to the young writer. When Crane was especially doubtful of his chances for success, Garland assured him,
"You'll be rich and famous in a year or 2. Successful authors always look back with a smile on their hard times."
You may be right, but it's no joke now. I'd trade my entire future for $23 in cash.
The New York City that Crane experienced in the 1890s held glimpses of wealth and high social position. Lower Manhattan was the center of the city's commercial activity. The Bowery was the hub of the excitement which made New York City a special place to be. The lively activities of its saloons, theaters, and dime museums gave the promise of good times. But sinister back streets and alleys gave the lie to the Bowery's bustling facade. All of this, the high life and low, Crane explored in his writing.
The true artist is the man who leaves pictures of his own time as they appear to him.
Crane's first novel, Maggie, A Girl of the Streets, was drawn from his experiences in the city. Because of its realism, it marks for many critics the beginning of modern American fiction.
It is inevitable that you will be greatly shocked by this book, but continue, please, with all possible courage to the end. For it tries to show that environment is a tremendous thing in the world, and frequently shapes lives.
The manuscript was rejected by all the publishers Crane approached. In March of 1893, only after Crane had paid for the printing himself, did it appear in book form. Aware that people would find Maggie shocking, Crane used the pen name of Johnston Smith.
You see, I was going to wait until the world was pyrotechnic about Johnston Smith's Maggie. And then I was going to flop down like a trapeze performer from the wire, and, coming forward with all the modest grace of a consumptive nun, say, "I am he, friends."
Maggie didn't sell. Crane stacked up copies and used them to sit on. Although deeply disappointed, he continued to write. Crane had the habit of unexpectedly dropping in on his friends. After exchanging pleasantries, he would often sprawl somewhere and start writing. Hamlin Garland recalled watching him write one of his poems during such a visit.
He took a seat and began to write steadily, composedly, without hesitation or blot, and so produced in my presence one of his most powerful verses. It flowed from his pen as smooth as oil.
I saw a man pursuing the horizon. Round and round they sped. I was disturbed at this. I accosted the man. "It is futile," I said. "You can never—" "You lie," he cried, and ran on.
In May of 1895, this and others of Crane's poems were published as a controversial collection called The Black Riders. Earlier, a condensed version of what would later become Crane's major novel, The Red Badge of Courage, had appeared in newspapers. It caused a sensation. Finally, Crane was receiving recognition as a writer. Still, he kept his newfound fame in perspective.
A man said to the universe, "Sir, I exist." "However," replied the universe, "the fact has not created in me a sense of obligation." Do not weep, maiden, for war is kind. Because your lover threw wild hands toward the sky, and the affrighted steed ran on alone, do not weep. War is kind. Hoarse booming drums of the regiment, little souls who thirst for fight, these men were born to drill and die. The unexplained glory flies above them. Great is the battle god, great, and his kingdom. A field where 1,000 corpses lie. Do not weep, babe, for war is kind. Because your father tumbled in the yellow trenches, raged at his breast, gulped and died, do not weep. War is kind. Swift blazing flag of the regiment, eagle with crest of red and gold, these men were born to drill and die. Point for them the virtue of slaughter. Make plain to them the excellence of killing, and a field where 1,000 corpses lie. Mother, whose heart hung humble as a button on the bright, splendid shroud of your son, do not weep. War is kind.
War and death. Stephen Crane's life was full of deaths. Brothers and sisters, his father, and when he was 20, his mother. He was convinced that his own life would be short, that he wouldn't live past 35. He therefore thrust himself fully into life. Whether participating or observing, he was preoccupied with the actual experience of living. Although he had achieved some fame through his writing, now, at the beginning of 1895, his curiosity and financial need led him to accept a newspaper assignment to go west and report. Crane liked the openness of what he saw, the people as well as the land.
I fell in love with the straight, out-and-out, sometimes hideous, often braggart Westerners because I thought them to be the truer men. We will see in the next 50 years what the West will do. They are serious, those fellows. When they are born, they take one big gulp of wind, and then they live.
Crane made use of his Western experience in writing some of his best short stories. In 1896, after his return from the West, Crane again set out as a correspondent. This time, to report on the Cuban rebellion against Spanish rule. He had written of war, but had not actually seen it. He was anxious to see if war was really the way he had imagined it. In Jacksonville, Florida, where he waited for a ship to take him to Cuba, Crane met Cora Taylor. Their budding romance was interrupted when, on New Year's Eve, 1896, Crane set sail on the Commodore, an ammunition ship. Nobody knows exactly what caused the disaster. Crane spent 30 perilous hours adrift in a dinghy on the high seas. From his remarkable experience, Crane wrote The Open Boat. After the shipwreck, Cora rushed to Daytona to bring Crane back to Jacksonville, where she nursed him back to health. Weeks passed. Unable to get to Cuba after all, and still anxious to view a real battle, Crane decided to cover the Greco-Turkish War. In Greece, Crane finally saw and heard his first battles.
It was a beautiful sound, beautiful as had never been dreamed. It was more impressive than the roar of Niagara and finer than thunder or an avalanche, because it had the wonder of human tragedy in it.
In Greece, Crane saw an infantryman shot in the head.
Behind him was the noise of battle, the roar and tumble of an enormous factory. This wounded soldier explained the distant roar. He defined it. This and worse was what was going on.
After Greece, Crane and Cora went to England, where they rented a house in Surrey. They lived as man and wife, though they were never able to marry because Cora's husband refused to give her a divorce. In England, Crane met and exchanged ideas with other writers, Henry James, H.G. Wells, and the highly esteemed Joseph Conrad. The Cranes were always short of money, for they lived in a high style and entertained as if they were running a free hotel for friends and mere acquaintances. In 1898, the Spanish-American War broke out, and Stephen Crane was always going off to war. He tried to enlist in the American Navy, but was rejected due to poor health. Even so, in April of 1898, Crane left Cora in England and went off to Cuba to cover the war for the New York World. Just as he had knocked down barriers to get at the unrespectable facts of city life, so now he broke away from the old romantic tradition of war reporting to get at the mind of the ordinary soldier.
War is death and a plague of the lack of small things and toil. War takes a long time. The swiftness in the chronology of battles is not correct in most books. Evidently one has time to get shaved, or lunch, or take a bath, often in battles whose descriptions read like whirlwinds. War is neither magnificent nor squalid. It is simply life.
Less than 2 weeks before the fighting ended, Crane, delirious with yellow fever, was evacuated from Cuba on a troop ship. In January of 1899, he returned to England. In his absence, Cora had rented Breed Place, a run-down 14th century manor house. It was here, with Cora, that Crane spent his last year of life. His health was shattered, his need for money desperate. Crane knew that he was dying. He had tuberculosis and had hemorrhaged several times. His strength was failing. Yet when someone mentioned his health, he wrote,
"Please have the kindness to keep your mouth shut about my health in front of Mrs. Crane hereafter. She can do nothing for me, and I am too old to be nursed. It's all up with me, but I will not have her scared. For some funny woman's reason, she likes me."
Crane died on June 5, 1900. He was only 28 years old. He seems too modern to be labeled a 19th century writer, nor is it easy to realize that a young man in his 20s wrote some of literature's finest short stories, and before he had even experienced war, his masterpiece, The Red Badge of Courage. Crane described Henry Fleming, the young hero of The Red Badge.
Henry had, of course, dreamed of battles all his life, of vague and bloody conflicts that had thrilled him with their sweep and fire. In visions, he had seen himself in many struggles. He had burned several times to enlist. Tales of great movements shook the land. He had read of marches, sieges, conflicts, and he longed to see it all.
Young Henry does enlist, and on his first day of battle, he and his company hold back a Confederate charge.
A man near him, who up to this time had been working feverishly at his rifle, suddenly stopped and ran with howls. The lad, whose face had borne an expression of exalted courage, was at an instant smitten, abject. He too threw down his gun and fled. There was no shame in his face. He ran like a rabbit.
The youth abruptly follows in unreasoning retreat.
His rifle and cap were gone. His unbuttoned coat bulged in the wind. On his face was all the horror of those things which he imagined.
As he retreats further from the battlefield, the youth learns that his regiment has actually held off the attack. Bitterly ashamed, he wanders off, trying to convince himself that it was the law of nature that had made him run. Eventually, the youth joins a line of wounded soldiers marching to the rear and finds among them his friend, Jim Conklin.
Tottering forward, he laid a quivering hand upon the man's arm. As the latter slowly turned his wax-like features toward him, the youth screamed, "God, Jim Conklin!" The soldier made a little commonplace smile. "Hello, Henry," he said. "You know," said the soldier, "I was out there, and by Jiminy, I got shot. I got shot." He reiterated this fact in a bewildered way, as if he did not know how it came about. The youth put forth anxious arms to assist him, but the soldier went firmly on, as if propelled. The youth wished his friend to lean upon him, but the other always shook his head and strangely protested, "No, no, no, leave me be. Leave me be." The youth had to follow. Presently, the latter heard a voice talking softly near his shoulders. Turning, he saw that it belonged to the tattered soldier. "You'd better take him out of the road, partner. There's a battery coming hellity-whoop down the road, and he'll get runned over. He's a goner anyhow in about 5 minutes, you can see that. You'd better take him out of the road. Where the blazes does he get his strength from?" "Lord knows," cried the youth. He was shaking his hands helplessly. "God, he's running." The youth saw his friend running in a staggering and stumbling way toward a little clump of bushes. His heart seemed to wrench itself almost free from his body at this sight. He made a noise of pain. He and the tattered man began a pursuit. At last they saw him stop and stand motionless. Hastening up, they perceived that his face wore an expression telling that he had at last found the place for which he struggled. His spare figure was erect. His bloody hands were quietly at his side. He was waiting with patience for something that he had come to meet. He was at the rendezvous. They paused and stood expectant. There was a silence. Suddenly, his form stiffened and straightened. He stared into space. To the two watchers, there was a curious and profound dignity in the firm lines of his awful face. Then he began to swing forward, slow and straight, in the manner of a falling tree. A swift, muscular contortion made the left shoulder strike the ground first. The body seemed to bounce a little way from the earth. "God," said the tattered soldier. The youth had watched, spellbound, the ceremony at the place of meeting. His face had been twisted into an expression of every agony he had imagined for his friend. He now sprang to his feet, and going closer, gazed upon the paste-like face. The mouth was opened, and the teeth showed in a laugh. As the flap of the blue jacket fell away from the body, he could see that the side looked as if it had been chewed by wolves. The youth turned with sudden, livid rage toward the battlefield. He shook his fist. Hell! The red sun was pasted in the sky like a wafer.
Stephen Crane found in war his basic metaphor for life. Life was, after all, a battle against indifferent forces, and man must make his own way. In his own life, Crane tested himself against the dangers of war. It seems clear that, wanting to get as near to life as possible, he found it necessary to get as near death as possible. The Red Badge of Courage is the memorable product of Stephen Crane's vision of life.